The trail wound like a faded ribbon through the pines, quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind across the rock face. It was the height of summer in the Colorado Rockies, blue skies unbroken, air thin and sweet. But somewhere along that trail, two teenage friends stepped into the shadow of something no one could have imagined. They vanished without a sound. 5 years later, a buried object would emerge from the earth, reshaping everything investigators thought they knew about that day. The calls began as mild concern. It was late July 2016, and by mid-afternoon, both families expected the two girls, 17-year-old Emily Carter and 16-year-old Zoe Ramirez, to be back from their day hike. The plan was simple. Start from the small gravel parking lot at Eagle Crest Trailhead. Follow the marked path to a ridgeline lookout. Eat the sandwiches packed by Zoe's mother. Then return by early evening. Both girls were familiar with the area. Emily's father was a volunteer with the local search and rescue team, and Zoe had been on dozens of treks with her family. It wasn't a risky route, only 6 miles round trip, with minimal elevation gain and clear signage at every fork. But by the time the sun began to tilt westward, the air cooling as shadows stretched over the canyon walls, neither girl had returned. Calls to their cell phones went unanswered. Initially, there was a rational explanation: poor reception in the backcountry. Perhaps they lingered at the lookout to take photos, or stopped to wade in one of the creek pools along the trail. But by 8 p.m., with darkness less than an hour away, unease hardened into alarm. Both families drove to the trailhead, their headlights cutting into the last light. Emily's father unlocked the small park office and checked the visitor log. Both girls had signed in at 9:22 that morning. There was no sign-out time. Their car, a dusty silver hatchback borrowed from Zoe's older sister, was still parked neatly in the lot. The interior held their change of clothes, a few energy bars, and a pair of sunglasses left on the dash. The local sheriff's department was called, and within an hour, 2 deputies arrived. Flashlights sliced through the encroaching dark as they hiked the first mile of the trail, calling the girls' names into the thickening night. Nothing answered but the echo of their own voices. By dawn the next morning, the search was fully mobilized. Eagle Crest was not vast compared to some parts of the Rockies, but its terrain was deceptive. The main trail ran along an open ridge, but beyond its edge lay steep descents into ravines, dense with lodgepole pine and spruce. Off-trail hiking here could quickly lead to disorientation. Search and rescue teams began at the trailhead and swept outward in expanding arcs. K-9 units caught a faint scent near a rocky outcrop just beyond the official lookout point, but lost it when the ground turned to loose scree. The scent was never regained. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors scattering birds from the treetops. From above, the mountains rolled in layers of green and gray, broken only by sudden sheer cliffs and glacial boulder fields. The searchers' fluorescent vests were tiny moving points against the vastness. Friends and classmates arrived to help, posting flyers in nearby towns and sharing the girls' last known photo on social media. Emily, with her easy grin and sun-lightened hair. Zoe, a little taller, darker, wearing the baseball cap she rarely took off. For the first week, the search ran on hope. Each day's failure to find them brought the same refrain. Maybe they were injured. Maybe they'd found shelter. Maybe they were waiting to be found. But by the 10th day, with no food caches disturbed, no makeshift shelters discovered, and no sightings reported, the operation began to scale down. Interviews were conducted with everyone who had been on the trail that day. Hikers recalled passing 2 girls matching their description near the halfway point. They were said to be laughing, taking photos, and moving at a comfortable pace. No one reported seeing them on the return route. The investigation widened. Their phones, later recovered from the family's homes, offered little to no recent messages, and the last outbound call from either was made 2 days prior. Theories swirled. Had they gone off-trail intentionally, chasing some new view or shortcut? Could they have fallen into one of the ravines, their bodies hidden in the tangle of underbrush and rock? Or, more darkly, had someone else crossed their path that afternoon? As summer turned to autumn, the case grew colder. Search efforts dwindled to occasional volunteer sweeps in good weather. For the families, life splintered into a before and after. Their daughters' rooms remained unchanged, clothing folded in drawers, posters still on the walls, and school binders stacked as if waiting for homework to resume. The official file listed them as missing, presumed deceased. But without bodies, without evidence, the word presumed became its own quiet torture. Then, in the spring of 2021, 5 years after the day Emily and Zoe walked into the hills and did not return, a construction crew working a private parcel of land 4 miles north of Eagle Crest made an unexpected find. Clearing ground for a foundation, a backhoe operator struck something solid beneath a thin layer of soil. At first, he thought it was a buried water tank or old septic drum, but when the bucket scraped away more dirt, the edge of something pale emerged. It wasn't metal, it was bone. He shut down the machine and called his foreman, who in turn called the sheriff. By late afternoon, the property was sealed off with crime scene tape. Under the churned soil lay the first physical trace of the 2 girls in half a decade. The construction site sat on the edge of a sloping meadow, bordered on 3 sides by thick timber. In winter, snowmelt from the ridge above funneled through here in small rivulets, softening the ground before draining into a narrow creek. On the day of the discovery, the earth was damp from recent rain, the air heavy with the smell of overturned soil and pine sap. Deputies arrived first, their boots sinking slightly into the mud as they moved toward the yellow excavator parked mid-slope. The operator stood off to one side, arms folded tightly across his chest, his face pale despite the cool air. He kept glancing back toward the spot where the machine's bucket had struck something it shouldn't have. The initial survey was cautious. The pale curve protruding from the dirt was unmistakably human, though only a small portion was exposed. A forensic team was summoned, along with the county coroner. Within the hour, a white tent was erected over the site to shield it from the elements and from the growing number of curious locals who had begun to gather at the property's edge. The land itself was privately owned, purchased 3 years earlier by a man intending to build a vacation home. Until the construction crew arrived, it had sat untouched for decades, overgrown and seldom visited. The proximity to the missing girls' last known area was impossible to ignore. The excavation was done by hand from that point forward, the soil sifted through mesh screens to catch even the smallest fragment. The first bones uncovered were part of a rib cage, followed by sections of a pelvis. These were quickly determined to belong to a young adult or adolescent female. Further digging revealed more skeletal remains, jumbled but contained within a single shallow grave, roughly 5 feet long. The depth was only enough to conceal the body beneath a thin covering of dirt and debris, suggesting the burial had been hurried. Items began to emerge from the soil along with the bones. A faded canvas backpack, its straps frayed and one zipper broken. Inside were a crushed water bottle, a pair of sunglasses with one arm missing, and a small, spiral-bound notebook swollen from moisture. The pages had fused together, their ink blurred into illegible streaks. But on the inside cover, faint under the dirt and water damage, was a name written in blue pen: Zoe. The coroner's preliminary assessment was that the remains were consistent with someone in their mid to late teens. Dental records would confirm the identity, but those on scene already understood the weight of what they had found. Forensic mapping of the site began immediately. Photographs documented the position of each bone, each object. Soil samples were collected from beneath the body, where decomposition fluids had seeped, staining the earth a darker shade. A short distance from the grave, investigators found something else: a strip of dark synthetic material tangled in the roots of a sapling. It appeared to be a section of heavy-duty nylon strap, the kind used for securing cargo. The strap was frayed at both ends, as if cut or torn. Though weathered, it still bore a faint chemical odor, like petroleum or machine oil. The discovery of the strap added a chilling dimension suggesting restraint or the securing of an object for transport. The property owner was interviewed on site. He stated he had no knowledge of the burial and had never visited the area before purchasing it. He'd bought the land at auction from the estate of an older man who had died in 2018. That man, in turn, had owned it since the late 1970s. There had been no records of the parcel being developed or even surveyed in decades. That meant whoever buried the body had either known the land was remote and unoccupied or had stumbled upon it and seized the opportunity. Word of the find traveled quickly. By evening, local news vans lined the county road, their antennas tilted skyward. Footage of the white tent and the muddy meadow played against archival images of Emily and Zoe from 5 years earlier. For the families, the news was both a wound and a confirmation of long-held fears. One family now had an answer, however incomplete. The other was thrust into even deeper uncertainty. The question that spread through the town wasn't just how Zoe's body ended up in that meadow. It was why Emily wasn't there too. The sheriff's office announced a joint investigation with the State Bureau, emphasizing that foul play was now presumed. Theories that had once seemed like whispered speculation now sat squarely at the center of the case, that the girls had encountered someone on the trail. Someone who had managed to isolate and control them long enough to separate them from their route and from each other. In the days that followed, the excavation area expanded. No additional human remains were found on the property, but a shallow depression 30 yards downstream yielded an unexpected piece of evidence. A crumpled section of blue polyester fabric, hardened in places by exposure and dirt. It appeared to be part of a windbreaker jacket, the kind sold in outdoor supply stores, in a style that Emily was known to wear. This fragment was bagged for analysis. Investigators now faced a landscape of possibilities. Had the girls been brought here together, with Emily somehow escaping or being taken elsewhere? Or had they been separated earlier, each meeting a different fate? The meadow itself offered few clues beyond the grave. The soil's composition preserved some trace evidence, but the elements over 5 years had erased much of what might have been recoverable. Still, forensic analysts held out hope for microscopic fibers, hair, or trace DNA embedded in the remains or in the nylon strap. Meanwhile, attention turned toward reconstructing the girls' final hours. Witnesses were recontacted. Search logs from 2016 were reviewed for overlooked details. Old tips, some dismissed at the time as unreliable, were reopened. The discovery of one body, after years of silence, had shifted the case from a missing persons investigation into a homicide inquiry. And somewhere out there, buried under half a decade of uncertainty, was the other half of the truth. The morning of July 27, 2016, began without urgency. In the small town that bordered the park, the day broke warm and cloudless, the kind of weather locals described as picture-perfect hiking light. Emily Carter was up first, slipping quietly into the kitchen to make coffee and toast before the rest of her family stirred. She wore her hair pulled back and had already packed her small teal day pack with water, a first aid kit, trail snacks, and her phone. Across town, Zoe Ramirez was moving at a more deliberate pace, tying the laces of her worn trail runners and triple-checking the sandwiches her mother had made the night before. Turkey on whole wheat, extra mustard, her favorite. The plan was straightforward. Meet at the Eagle Crest trailhead just before 9. Start early to avoid the midday heat, reach the lookout by noon, and be home well before dinner. The Eagle Crest Trail wasn't remote by Colorado standards. It began just a mile off a paved county road, its parking lot big enough for a dozen vehicles. The path itself was well maintained, the result of both park funding and volunteer labor. Its first mile wound through meadows, dotted with wildflowers, before climbing into the shaded switchbacks of pine and spruce. For experienced hikers like Emily and Zoe, it was routine terrain. At 9:15 a.m., Emily's mother dropped her off at the trailhead. She spotted Zoe already there, leaning against the hatchback with her pack slung over one shoulder. They signed the trail register together, writing their names side by side in neat block letters, and noted their intended return time as 5 p.m. The first stretch of the hike was uneventful. Other hikers remembered passing them that morning. Two girls chatting easily, pausing occasionally to take photos. One couple recalled seeing them about 2 miles in, where the trail curved along a low ridge with sweeping views of the valley. They were eating granola bars, Zoe perched on a rock and Emily crouched beside her, tying a shoelace. By late morning, the sun was high, but tempered by a light breeze funneled through the canyon. A trail camera positioned near a fork, about 3 miles from the trailhead, captured the girls at 11:42 a.m., walking side by side. Emily's jacket was tied around her waist. Zoe had her baseball cap pulled low against the glare. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to confirm their direction. They were still heading toward the lookout. That was the last verified sighting. Somewhere beyond that point, the timeline began to fray. The trail to the lookout was straightforward, but past the marker, a network of unofficial paths branched away. Some led to secondary viewpoints. Others simply petered out into dense undergrowth. Rangers discouraged venturing off these main routes, but the lure of an unmarked path could be strong, especially for those seeking a new perspective on familiar terrain. Investigators later examined those side trails, noting one in particular that peeled away subtly from the main track just before the lookout. It sloped downward into a shaded gully, the air cooler and still. In summer, that gully held pockets of snowmelt-fed water, a tempting detour on a warm day. Whether Emily and Zoe took that turn willingly or were led there remains unknown. The afternoon brought a gradual shift in conditions. Though the sky stayed mostly clear, the wind picked up along the ridges, bringing with it a faint smell of ozone, the kind that precedes a distant storm. By 2:00 p.m., hikers descending from the lookout reported seeing no sign of the girls. One group of 3 recalled passing through the area where the gully met the main trail and hearing what they thought were voices, though they couldn't place the direction. Searchers later considered this a potentially significant moment, the last possible indication the girls were together and above ground. What happened next was a blank. No one else on the trail that day remembered passing them on the return route. Their absence went unnoticed until the first calls from the families began that evening. When the search started the next morning, the gully drew particular attention. It was searched repeatedly, teams combing every meter of brush and scree. Nothing was found. No clothing, no gear, no footprints beyond what could be attributed to other hikers. It was as if the ground itself had closed over them. The search logs from that week reveal a mounting frustration. Day after day, grid sweeps turned up nothing. Aerial surveys showed no disturbance in the underbrush, large enough to conceal 2 people. Dogs brought in from other counties caught scent trails that looped unpredictably, then died out in open areas with no clear exit point. The lack of physical evidence was almost more unsettling than a clear sign of struggle would have been. Investigators began to consider the possibility that whatever had happened had taken place quickly and with precision before the girls had a chance to leave any trace. In later interviews, one veteran search coordinator admitted it was the first time in his 20-year career that he'd seen a case where 2 people disappeared in daylight from a well-traveled trail without a single confirmed clue left behind. That absence would haunt the case for years. And yet, as the 2021 discovery showed, traces do not always remain absent forever. They simply wait, hidden, until the right disturbance brings them to the surface. The meadow where Zoe was found lay far from the gully, connected only by an irregular lattice of old logging tracks and game trails. How she had traveled or been transported there was a question that would soon pull investigators into a deeper, darker part of the search. The meadow where the remains were found was deceptively serene. Waist-high grass swayed under the late summer breeze, dotted with clumps of sage and low thistle. From a distance, it could have been mistaken for any number of forgotten clearings in the foothills, its boundaries framed by the dark lines of conifers pressing in from all sides. But at ground level, the scene was starkly different. The disturbed soil formed an irregular oval, its edges marked by tufts of pale grass bent and broken in a way that suggested recent growth over older disruption. The forensic team had marked the perimeter with thin yellow flags, each planted at the edge of a grid square. Inside the cordon, the work was slow and methodical. Every shovelful of earth was lifted, sifted, and bagged. The partially exposed bones were handled with deliberate care, each fragment photographed in situ before removal. The grave was deep enough to suggest effort, but not professional skill. Uneven walls, pockets of compacted clay beside loose fill. In the upper layers, soil yielded small shards of organic material, fragments of cloth, faded to the color of ash, what appeared to be a corroded zipper, and a single cracked plastic bead. By mid-afternoon, the skeletal remains were fully uncovered. The recovery team paused, their silence thick in the heat. The bones were largely intact, save for natural weathering and animal activity. The skull bore no fractures. The ribs showed no signs of violent trauma. The absence of obvious injury was notable but not conclusive cause of death that would have to be determined later, if at all. When the remains were lifted, the earth beneath revealed something the surface had hidden, a thin layer of black polyethylene sheeting, crumpled and torn. Not a full tarp, but enough to indicate that at some point the body had been wrapped or covered. The plastic bore streaks of a dark, oily residue. Samples were taken immediately. That night, the remains were transported to the county medical examiner's office. There, under the harsh light of the autopsy room, the identity was confirmed through dental records. It was Zoe Ramirez. For her family, the news was both an end and a beginning. An end to years of uncertainty and a beginning to the harder question of how she had ended up in that grave. The investigative team's focus shifted from recovery to reconstruction. The meadow was remote, but not unreachable. An old logging track, barely visible under decades of encroaching growth, ran less than 200 yards away. Satellite imagery revealed it connected indirectly, and with several branching paths, to a network of disused service roads dating back to the 1970s. Whoever buried Zoe had not needed to hike her body in by foot. They could have driven most of the way. Soil analysis added another layer. Samples from the plastic sheeting showed traces of fine volcanic dust, chemically distinct from the meadow's natural soil. It wasn't local to that immediate area. Investigators began mapping potential sources, cross-referencing old geological surveys. Only a handful of deposits in the county matched that signature. It was an unusual clue, but one that could prove critical. The fragment of tarp was another lead. Laboratory testing revealed it to be a high-grade agricultural polyethylene, UV-resistant, the type used to cover heavy equipment or large stacks of feed. Not a common camping tarp, and not something easily acquired at a small-town hardware store. Distribution records narrowed possible purchase points to a few rural suppliers within a 50-mile radius. The overlap between those suppliers' customer bases and the mapped volcanic soil deposits created a short but telling list of potential property owners. Detectives began pulling county tax records, looking for isolated properties accessible by old service roads. They also reviewed case files from 2016, searching for any incident reports in that corridor: trespassing, illegal dumping, timber poaching that might hint at someone familiar with the terrain. One name surfaced more than once: a man in his late 50s, known locally for his reclusive habits and short temper. His property lay in the shadow of an abandoned sawmill, bordered by one of the mapped volcanic deposits. He owned heavy equipment, according to prior permit filings, and he had purchased supplies from one of the tarp distributors the year before Zoe and Emily vanished. At this stage, nothing tied him directly to the burial, but the convergence of details was enough to place him near the top of the list. The decision was made to proceed carefully. The suspect was unlikely to respond well to direct questioning, and premature contact could jeopardize the investigation. For now, surveillance was the priority. Unmarked vehicles began appearing at the edge of his property's access road. Drones were deployed from concealed positions to photograph the yard and outbuildings. From above, the patterns were telling. Multiple rolls of black polyethylene stored beside a rusted tractor, a diesel tank leaning against the side of a shed, and the same reddish-brown volcanic soil covering the driveway. The parallels to the meadow evidence were impossible to ignore. But proximity and similarity weren't proof. To secure a warrant, investigators needed something that tied him specifically to Zoe: an object, a trace, or an eyewitness placing her in his presence. That evidence would come, unexpectedly, from a place no one had searched in years: the storage loft of a disused ranger station, where boxes of unprocessed tips from 2016 still gathered dust. In one of those boxes was a handwritten note, unsigned, dropped into a station mailbox weeks after the girls disappeared. It described seeing a man in a green pickup driving away from a gated trail spur the evening they went missing. The note mentioned the partial license plate 3 digits that matched the suspect's registration at the time. It had been overlooked in the early chaos, filed without follow-up. Now, it was the missing link investigators needed. The path from meadow to manhunt was no longer theoretical. It was narrowing, closing. And soon, it would reach the door of the man whose property matched every trace left behind. The warrant was signed just after dawn, by 7:00 a.m. The convoy rolled quietly up the access road, with 2 marked units in front to establish presence, followed by an unmarked SUV carrying the lead investigator, the crime scene supervisor, and a forensics photographer. At the rear, a box truck waited with the evidence collection team. The suspect's property sat at the end of a gravel loop, partially hidden by a stand of aspen that quaked in the morning wind. From the road, only the roofline of the main cabin was visible, shingles mottled with age. Closer in, outbuildings emerged: 2 sheds, a sagging barn, and the rusted skeleton of a small tractor. A green pickup truck was parked under a lean-to, its hood streaked with dust. The suspect, a heavy-set man with graying hair and a deeply lined face, emerged from the cabin's front door before the team reached the porch. His expression was a mixture of irritation and wariness, the look of someone who knew this visit wasn't casual. He read the warrant, his eyes flicking over the document, but never lingering on the text. When asked if he understood, he nodded once, curtly, then stepped back to let them in. The cabin's interior was dim and cluttered, the air heavy with the mingled scents of wood smoke and oil. Boots were lined haphazardly by the door. The kitchen table held a scattering of mail, tools, and a half-empty mug of coffee. A single path wound through the mess toward a narrow hallway at the back. The search began methodically. 2 investigators worked the interior, while others moved to the sheds and barn. In the largest outbuilding, under a canvas tarp stiff with dust, they found a stack of rolled black polyethylene identical in texture and gauge to the fragment recovered from Zoe's grave. Each roll was tagged with a manufacturer's code, the same lot number traced through distributor records. Beside the rolls sat a coil of heavy-duty nylon cargo straps, several frayed at the ends, bearing faint dark stains. Samples were taken on site, each bagged and labeled. Behind the barn, a patch of ground caught the eye of one searcher. It was irregular, slightly raised at one end, the grass a different shade from the surrounding area. When probed with a soil auger, the earth yielded a faint, sweet odor, organic but not purely vegetal. The decision was made to photograph and sample the area, but leave excavation for a controlled forensic dig. Inside the cabin, the narrow hallway led to a small back room with a padlocked door. The lock was old but yielded quickly to a pry bar. Behind it, the room was little more than a storage closet, but its contents drew the search team up short. On the top shelf sat a faded teal day pack, the zipper corroded and one strap partially torn. Inside was a collection of personal items: a compact mirror, a chapstick tube, a digital camera with a cracked display, and a folded paper map of Eagle Crest Trail. Written in small block letters in the upper right corner of the map was the name Emily. The camera's battery was dead, but its memory card was intact. That card would later yield a sequence of photos, the last taken at 12:03 p.m. on the day of the hike. Emily and Zoe standing at an overlook, smiling at the lens. Nothing in the background suggested distress. It was a snapshot of normalcy, captured minutes or hours before everything shifted. In the bottom of the pack was something else. A scrap of blue polyester fabric, hardened with dirt, consistent in texture and color, with the fragment found downslope from Zoe's grave. Lab analysis would later confirm the fibers matched exactly. At that moment, the tone of the search shifted. What had begun as suspicion was hardening into connection. The lines between the suspect's property and the girl's disappearance, now drawn in physical evidence. The suspect was placed under arrest on an unrelated outstanding warrant for illegal dumping, an expedient measure to hold him while the homicide case was built. He offered no resistance, though his eyes moved constantly, assessing, calculating. In the days that followed, the forensic dig behind the barn revealed no additional human remains, but in the topsoil were microscopic traces of the same volcanic dust found on the tarp in the meadow. Tire tread impressions preserved in hardened mud near the property's side gate were compared against the green pickup's tires. The match was not perfect. The wear had changed over time, but several unique cuts in the tread aligned. The investigative team now faced the task of bridging the gap. How Zoe's body had traveled from the trail to the meadow, and what had happened to Emily in those same hours. The digital camera, once charged, provided a partial thread. Metadata showed the last image at the overlook was followed by a 42-minute gap before the camera was powered off. No further images were taken. Investigators speculated this window represented the critical period when the girls were intercepted. But by whom and whether both had been taken together remained the question. What was certain now was that the man in the cabin had possessed items belonging to both girls, stored carefully, not discarded. That choice preservation instead of disposal hinted at a motive or meaning yet to be understood. And somewhere in that property's shadow, in its past, or in its soil, was the other half of a story that had been buried for 5 years. The interview room was a neutral gray cinder block walls, one table, 3 chairs, and a single camera eye fixed in the corner. The suspect sat hunched forward, elbows on the table, his wrists free but his posture constrained, as though the air itself had weight. Across from him, 2 detectives, the lead investigator, measured and deliberate, and her partner, who played the quieter role, letting silences work like wedges. The recording began with a litany of procedural markers: date, time, location, and case reference. The suspect answered in monosyllables, his voice low, a gravelly rasp that seemed unused to sustained conversation. At first, he denied knowing the names shown on the printed photographs. He claimed the teal day pack had been found out in the woods years ago, and that he'd kept it because you never know when a bag might come in handy. When asked why the contents hadn't been thrown away, he shrugged. Didn't think about it. The detectives let the denial settle before sliding a second photo across the table. This one, a close-up of the tarp roll found in his shed, the manufacturer's lot number circled in red. They explained the match to the fragment recovered from the meadow grave. He shifted in his chair, crossing his arms, his gaze fixed on the tabletop. "Lots of people got tarps like that," he muttered. The lead detective didn't argue the point. Instead, she asked where he'd been on the afternoon the girls disappeared. That was the first time he paused. His eyes flicked up, meeting hers for a fraction of a second before dropping again. "Don't remember," he said, but his tone lacked the flat certainty of truth. They moved methodically, layering evidence, camera metadata, fiber analysis, the volcanic dust in his soil samples, each fact placed carefully in front of him, without accusation, as if letting him connect the dots himself. The quiet detective finally spoke, his voice almost conversational. "It's been 5 years. That's a long time to carry something like this around. The suspect's jaw worked, muscles tight, but he said nothing. When the teal daypack was placed on the table, still dusted with the dirt from his closet shelf, he stared at it for a long moment. His hand twitched once, as if to reach for it, but he didn't move. The lead detective leaned in slightly. "We know this didn't start with you looking for trouble. Things happen fast out there. Accidents happen. But the choices after that's where lines get crossed." For the first time, his expression shifted just a fraction, but enough to register. It was the smallest flinch, like someone hearing a distant, unwelcome echo. The silence that followed was stretched thin. He broke it with a slow exhale. "You think you know," he said. "But you don't." The detectives didn't press. Instead, they let him fill the space. He began to speak in fragments about a hike he'd taken years earlier, to check an old logging road, about hearing voices in the trees, about finding someone sitting on a rock, head in hands. When asked if it was one of the missing girls, he dodged. "Doesn't matter who it was," he said. "What matters is what they told me." The story twisted, details emerging in a crooked sequence. An injury, a wrong turn, and a panic that escalated. He claimed one girl had been hurt, limping bad, and that the other had been real protective. They'd asked for directions to the main road. He said he'd pointed them toward a trail, but they didn't make it that far. When pressed on why, he clammed up again, retreating into half-statements and non-sequiturs. The detectives shifted tactics, returning to the physical evidence. They pointed out that Zoe's body had been buried in a place only someone with deep local knowledge would choose, a dry patch in an otherwise damp meadow, away from root systems that could expose the grave. The suspect didn't deny knowing the area. He even smirked faintly, as if to acknowledge the skill involved. But when asked where Emily was, the smirk vanished. "Not here," he said, shaking his head slowly. "She's not here." Whether that meant she was alive or buried somewhere else entirely remained unspoken. The session stretched past 3 hours. Small admissions crept in. He'd crossed paths with them. He'd tried to help. He'd made mistakes. But every time the conversation edged towards specifics, time, place, sequence, he pulled back, wrapping himself in vague phrasing. When the detectives finally stepped out, leaving him alone under the camera's gaze, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, his expression unreadable. The recording caught a single quiet sentence. "Spoken to no one. Should have walked away." Outside the room, the team was split. Some believed he was holding back out of fear, others out of calculation. Either way, they agreed on one thing. The partial story he'd offered was just enough to confirm contact with both girls, but nowhere near enough to close the case. Somewhere between the tarp in his shed, the daypack in his closet, and the grave in the meadow, the rest of the truth was still buried. The crime lab's evidence room was quiet, its air tinged with the faint chemical scent of preservation agents and sterile storage. Under the bright, shadowless light of the examination table, the teal daypack lay unzipped, its contents arranged with surgical precision. Every thread, every particle, every faint stain was catalogued. For months, the focus had been on the tarp and the burial site, but the lab's lead trace analyst had been drawn back to the bag, not because of what it contained, but because of what had been missed. Inside the smallest compartment, tucked behind the fabric lining, was a compact layer of pale sediment, trapped in the stitching. It was almost invisible until a beam of angled light revealed a thin crust of dried silt, the kind that clings after wet ground has been crossed and then baked dry in the sun. When analyzed, the particles told a story. The mineral profile was distinct, a blend of fine quartz and dark volcanic fragments, bound with an organic compound common in wetlands, but rare in the rocky slopes where the girls had been hiking. That combination didn't match the meadow gravesite. In fact, it didn't match anywhere within 2 miles of it. This was a different place entirely. The analyst mapped the signature against regional soil surveys. Only a handful of sites in the county had that composition, and most were inaccessible marsh pockets, remnants of seasonal floodplains tucked deep into the forest. One of them was less than half a mile from an old, unmarked road that had fallen out of use decades earlier. On satellite imagery, the road appeared as a faint scar beneath the canopy, leading to a clearing where a collapsed wooden structure sat in ruin. The structure wasn't on any current maps, but archival forestry records showed it had once been a supply shack for logging crews in the 1950s. The connection wasn't direct. There was no guarantee the sediment came from that specific location, but it was enough to justify a targeted search. When the team set out, the air was damp, the canopy holding the morning fog like a ceiling of ghostly vapor. They parked where the road was still navigable and continued on foot, the path narrowing as ferns and vine maple reclaimed the corridor. After 20 minutes, the woods opened into the clearing. The shack was little more than a skeletal frame of beams and weathered planks, its roof caved in, its floor half sunk into the wet ground. Rusted tools and scraps of iron lay half buried in the mud. The soil here matched the lab sample exactly. Around the perimeter, searchers moved slowly, their boots sinking into the spongy ground. Then one of them called out soft at first, then sharper. Near the tree line, partially obscured by moss and creeping ground cover, was a scatter of fabric scraps. The colors were muted by weather and time, but one piece, a thin strip of faded purple, stood out. It was consistent with the shade of the windbreaker Emily had been wearing when she disappeared. Nearby, buried under a thin layer of silt, they found the fragment of a shoe sole, size appropriate for a teenager, the tread worn but intact. Both items were bagged, labeled, and carried to the forensic tent, set up at the edge of the clearing. As the team continued their sweep, a cadaver dog alerted near a shallow depression in the ground, about 10 yards from the shack. The soil here was darker and more compacted, but a preliminary probe revealed no remains, only a void beneath, as if the earth had been disturbed and then collapsed over time. It could have been an old storage pit, or it could have been something else. They marked the spot for full excavation. Back at the command center, the new evidence was laid out. The purple fabric strip, under microscopic examination, revealed faint traces of dried blood embedded in the fibers. The DNA profile came back as a partial match to Emily's family reference sample. It wasn't definitive, too degraded to meet the full threshold, but it was enough to intensify the suspicion that she'd been at this location after leaving the original trail. The sole fragment, meanwhile, carried traces of the same marsh silt and, more disturbingly, a residue of aged diesel, similar to what had been found on the tarp in the meadow. That overlap linked the shack site and the burial site through a common contaminant, narrowing the possibilities. The suspect had been evasive in his interviews, but he had never mentioned this place. If he had been here, he'd have taken great care to erase the trail, or thought he had. Investigators began reviewing his known movements and historical property records again. A buried entry in a decades-old land lease showed that the shack site fell within an area his family had rights to for seasonal logging when he was a teenager. It wasn't proof, but it suggested familiarity, a mental map that could explain how someone could navigate here unseen. The excavation at the shack site was scheduled for the following week, but the weight of possibility hung heavy over the team. They had something tangible, now physical, evidence tied to Emily, a location no one had searched, and a direct environmental link to the tarp used to hide Zoe. If Emily had made it this far, the marsh had either hidden her for 5 years or kept her just out of reach until now. The morning of the excavation broke gray and windless, the kind of sky that seems to press down on the tree line. At the edge of the clearing, the air hung damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of rot rising from the marsh soil. The skeletal remains of the shack loomed over the site, its warped beams tilting toward collapse, as if straining under the weight of decades of silence. The forensic team worked in a hushed rhythm, their tools clinking softly against one another as they assembled the perimeter mark. Every step into the saturated ground was deliberate, each boot print filling with a slow seep of murky water, Cadaver dogs had already alerted twice on the depression near the tree line, and that's where they began. A lead archaeologist directed the process, knowing the ground could be treacherous. In marsh soil, decomposition is slower, and the waterlogged sediment can preserve organic material unnervingly well. It also collapses easily, meaning any disturbance could erase fragile evidence. The first shovelfuls came up thick and dark, the water pooling instantly in the shallow cut. The smell, faint at first, grew sharper as layers were peeled back. Beneath the black muck was a mat of intertwined roots, a natural barrier that had to be sliced through with care. When the blade finally sank into a softer layer below, one of the technicians froze. Something pale had emerged from the dark sediment, a curve, smooth and narrow, coated in silt, a bone unmistakably human. The work slowed even further. Brushes replaced shovels. The soil teased away in patient strokes until the curve revealed itself fully. It was a partial jawbone, still holding 3 teeth, their enamel dull but intact. A second bone followed longer, slender the shaft of a humerus. Both were flagged and photographed before being lifted into sterile evidence trays. The team pressed on, widening the excavation in careful, concentric circles. Every few inches brought something else: rib fragments, vertebrae, and small bones from hands or feet. There was no full skeleton yet, but the distribution suggested scattering over time, likely from the shifting ground. The marsh had not given them a grave in the traditional sense. It had given them a slow, disarticulated release. Then came the object that stopped everyone cold. Near the base of the depression, wrapped tight in the roots of an alder sapling, was a small, weathered rectangle of nylon. The color was dulled to a grayish-brown by silt, but under the film of mud, it was faintly pink. A zipper ran along its edge, corroded but intact. It was a child's backpack, lightweight, the kind used for day hikes. Inside was little more than sludge and a few unrecognizable scraps of paper. But the size, the shape, and the faint hue were all too close to what Zoe had been carrying the day she disappeared. The link wasn't confirmed yet, but the weight in the air shifted. No one here thought it belonged to anyone else. As the day went on, the clearing transformed into a landscape of flagged markers and evidence bags. The shack silhouette remained unmoving, but it felt less like an abandoned structure now, and more like a silent witness. The environmental unit ran rapid DNA tests on the teeth from the jawbone. By late afternoon, the results came through partial matches again, degraded by years in waterlogged soil, but strong enough to align with Emily's maternal line. The confirmation moved through the site like a ripple, the quiet intensifying rather than breaking. Emily had been here. Whether she had died here or been brought after, the marsh had held her for 5 years, unmarked and unsearched. The child's backpack was sent for accelerated processing, its fabric swabbed for trace evidence. Diesel residue was found in faint concentrations, linking it once again to the tarp from the meadow, and the sole fragment found earlier. 3 locations and 3 distinct but connected signatures were now forming a triangle on the investigation map. That triangle enclosed a region of dense forest and back roads, much of it unpatrolled, and all of it reachable without touching the main hiking trails. In the command tent, maps lay spread out under plastic sheeting, pins marking the shack, the meadow, and the suspect's property. The roads between them were almost invisible from the air, but on foot, they formed a rough corridor through terrain most people avoided. Whoever had used it knew the land intimately. By dusk, the excavation halted, the site secured for the night. Floodlights cast the clearing in a harsh, artificial glow, the shack's shadow stretching across the flagged depressions. In the stillness, the ground seemed to exhale, the marsh reclaiming the shallow cuts as the water seeped back in. The remains would be taken for a full autopsy, but already the shape of events was emerging. The marsh had given them Emily, or what was left of her, but not her story, not yet. There was still the matter of how she'd come to be here, whether she'd been alive when she arrived, and what the shack had been used for before time stripped it down to bare beams. Somewhere in those answers might be the key to closing the 5-year loop that began on a summer trail and ended in a place where the ground itself kept secrets. The autopsy began the following morning inside the county's forensic facility, a climate-controlled chamber sealed off from the rest of the building. The remains from the marsh were laid out on a stainless steel table, the bones rinsed free of sediment in a series of shallow trays. Even stripped of their context, the smell of peat and stagnant water lingered, clinging to the air. Dr. Lawson, the lead forensic anthropologist, began with the skeletal inventory. Every fragment was measured, catalogued, and photographed, then arranged in anatomical order as best the partial recovery allowed. What they had was incomplete, about 60% of a full skeleton, but it was enough to work with. The first step was confirming identity through dental comparison. The match to Emily was definitive this time, with the unique arrangement of her molars and a chip in the enamel, exactly as recorded in her childhood dental records. But the questions didn't end there. The surface of the bones told a more complex story than simple burial. On the humerus and femur, Lawson noted faint, narrow striations, parallel lines etched into the outer surface. Under magnification, they appeared consistent with marks made by a serrated blade. They were not deep, and they didn't cut into the marrow, but they were deliberate. These were not the marks of scavengers or natural processes. They were human-made. That detail alone shifted the working theory. It suggested dismemberment, or at least modification of the remains after death, possibly to make transport easier. But the timing, whether these cuts happened perimortem or postmortem, was still unclear. Then came the toxicology, drawn not from fluids, which the marsh had long since claimed, but from bone marrow and preserved hair fragments. The results were startling. Trace elements of phenobarbital, a strong sedative, were present in concentrations too high to be accidental. The compound bonds tightly in bone over time, meaning Emily had ingested or been administered the drug in the hours before her death. Phenobarbital wasn't something one stumbled across in a hiker's first aid kit. It was a controlled substance, often used in veterinary settings or to manage severe seizures. That detail, combined with the serration marks, pointed sharply toward premeditation. Emily had been incapacitated before she died. The cause of death was still listed as undetermined. The bones bore no signs of blunt force trauma, fractures, or bullet wounds, but the presence of the sedative, the blade marks, and the clandestine disposal told their own version of events. Back in the incident room, the investigators pinned a new sheet to the board. Phenobarbital source? Only certain facilities or individuals could access it legally, and the paper trail for such a controlled substance was tight. A quick search through regional licensing turned up fewer than 24 veterinary practices within a 100-mile radius, plus a scattering of agricultural supply outlets that handled livestock medications, and one name kept overlapping in other parts of the map. A retired large animal veterinarian who owned property less than 6 miles from the shack site, land that brushed against the very corridor linking the meadow to the marsh. He was not a stranger to law enforcement. Years earlier, he'd been cited for unpermitted disposal of livestock remains and illegal pesticide storage. Nothing violent, but enough to paint a picture of someone operating far from oversight. When detectives drove the backroads past his property, they noted 2 things: a weathered barn with a padlocked side door, and stacked neatly beneath a lean-to, several rolls of industrial-grade black tarp identical in appearance to the samples from the meadow and the suspect's original property. No contact was made, yet they needed more. Surveillance was set up discreetly, a trail camera hidden in the tree line along one of the narrow access roads he used. The plan was to watch and wait, see if his movements revealed a connection before moving in. Meanwhile, the forensics team went back to the shack site for a secondary sweep. Metal detectors passed over the ground where the floorboards had rotted away and picked up faint signals. Digging carefully, they recovered 2 rusted items: the remnants of a folding camp chair and a thin steel chain, its links fused by corrosion. Both were logged, though neither immediately screamed relevance. But when cleaned, The chain revealed something more unsettling. A fabric cuff still attached to one end, frayed and stained. Lab analysis showed traces of phenobarbital there too. It was becoming harder to see the shack as just a waypoint in the story. It looked more like a holding site, a place where at least one victim had been restrained and sedated before ending up in the marsh. The question now was whether Emily had been alone there, or if Zoe had been with her. If both girls had been taken to the shack, then the second body might still be somewhere in the corridor or beyond it. That possibility hardened the urgency in the room. The sedative had been a breakthrough, the blade marks another. Together, they painted a picture more controlled, more deliberate than anyone had guessed in the early years. The narrative of two girls simply vanishing on a hike was gone. This was no longer just a missing persons case. It was a method, a pattern, and maybe, if the wrong person had reason to repeat it, a cycle waiting to restart. The warrant for the veterinarian's property was signed just after dawn. The judge, convinced by the convergence of evidence of phenobarbital access, proximity to the shack and marsh, and the presence of industrial tarp, identical to that recovered from the meadow. The tactical team assembled at a staging point a mile away, waiting for the green light. The plan was to move in quietly, secure the suspect without incident, and preserve the scene intact for the forensic sweep. The approach road was little more than 2 ruts carved into clay, bordered by barbed wire and tall grass that had turned brittle in the late summer heat. At the end of the track, the barn rose like a blackened silhouette, its metal roof sagging in the middle, a padlock glinting faintly on the side door. The main house sat farther back, a low ranch structure with drawn curtains and a collapsed porch rail. The man emerged as they rolled in, barefoot, wearing grease-stained coveralls. He didn't resist. His eyes moved from one officer to another, but settled on the lead detective with an expression that was neither surprise nor anger, more like resignation. He was escorted to a waiting vehicle while the search began. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. Tools hung from nails along one wall, some coated in a film of rust, others still sharp and clean. In the far corner, stacked 3 high, were sealed plastic tubs. The first 2 held veterinary supplies, syringes, glass vials, surgical gloves, most within expiration. The third was heavier. Inside, beneath a folded canvas tarp, lay 2 wooden crates. One was empty. The other contained what looked like soil, mixed with fragments of bone no larger than a thumbnail. These were bagged immediately. The phenobarbital connection was confirmed on site with 2 bottles, both partly full, labeled for equine use. Their lot numbers matched shipments to a local feed supplier that had been flagged earlier in the investigation. But the real find came from a section of the barn floor that didn't match the rest. Near the rear wall, the concrete gave way to dirt, a rectangle about 6 by 3 feet. A faint depression marked the center. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in and showed a distinct anomaly 2 feet down, dense enough to be solid but irregular in shape. The digging was done slowly, every trowel scrape monitored. 6 inches down, the first layer of black tarp appeared, folded tightly. Beneath it was a bundle of bones, smaller than the ones found in the marsh. The clothing remnants still clung to parts of the frame, a hoodie with faded stitching, and denim with the knees worn white. The dental records left no doubt. It was Zoe. The barn became a sealed scene, the hum of generators powering work lights against the encroaching dusk. Every item was photographed, logged, and swabbed. A length of chain, matching the one from the shack site, was found looped around a support beam. It too bore phenobarbital traces. The presence of both girls' remains, one in the marsh and one under the barn floor, shattered the theory that they might have been separated in the early stages. Instead, the evidence suggested they had been taken together, held in the shack, sedated, and then killed, though not at the same time. The position of Zoe's remains, the absence of water damage, and the state of decomposition all pointed to her being buried on site almost immediately after death. Emily's transport to the marsh, by contrast, required movement over distance and time. In the interview room later, the suspect's account was thin and self-serving. He claimed he'd found the girls already disoriented near an old trail spur, that he'd brought them in for safety, but panicked when one collapsed. The sedative, he said, was to calm them, though he could not explain why both ended up dead. His story bent under the weight of the forensic record, blade marks, chemical traces, restraint evidence, and finally broke when confronted with a photograph taken at the shack site years earlier, recovered from a neighbor's discarded trail camera. It showed him standing in the doorway, the outline of a figure behind him, barely visible through the slats. The case closed with grim finality. The timeline was reconstructed as follows. The girls took the trail spur during their hike, encountered the man on his property boundary, and were coaxed or forced toward the shack. There they were sedated, restrained, and ultimately killed. Zoe was buried beneath the barn almost immediately. Emily's body was moved days later to the marsh, wrapped in tarp and weighted down, perhaps in a failed attempt to sink her beyond discovery. The shack remained the silent midpoint of their ordeal, a place that had stood untouched while search teams combed the surrounding mile. When the files were sealed, the boards cleared, and the evidence boxed for storage, there was no celebration in the incident room, only a dull quiet. The 5-year gap between their disappearance and the first real break had closed, but it left a shadow behind. For the families, there was no justice that could balance the years lost. For the investigators, the case was both a resolution and a reminder that in the spaces between the known and the hidden, time does not heal so much as bury, and that the ground can hold its secrets until someone is willing to cut it open and see what waits beneath. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories of disappearances, investigations, and the secrets hidden in the most unexpected places, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one.